Thank you so much, President Craig. I'm so pleased to be introducing my nephew, Larry Schooler, who is the father of two and the husband of one. In his spare time, he is a director and senior facilitator with the communications firm Kearns West in Austin, one of the nation's leading providers of consensus building services for public and private organizations. Dr. Schooler also teaches conflict resolution and facilitative leadership at the University of Texas, Hook'em Horns, my alma mater. He also co-hosts a dispute resolution podcast called Resolutions, and is the author of a forthcoming book, we can't just have one author in the family, on how the United States can resolve conflicts on a large scale, including those we face today involving race and culture. Dr. Schooler first visited San Francisco at the age of 2 and has returned many times since. And he appreciates the area's remarkable diversity and transportation. Where he comes from in Texas, there's either the car or the horse. Please help me welcome Dr. Larry Schooler.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning, San Francisco and the world. I'm delighted to be here, and I was thinking of starting out with a joke, but I felt a little conflicted, so I'm not going to. I think that would be, out of bad taste. I'm somebody who believes that there are no accidents, and even though I think that Aunt Janice picked this date relatively at random, yesterday was actually the anniversary of the death of my great-grandmother, Janice's grandmother, Ella Siegel. And if it weren't for Nana, I wouldn't be talking to you like this today. Nana essentially fled Tsarist Russia on foot with her husband and her daughter, my grandmother Sylvia, who you've heard about a lot, and braved a lot of very difficult conditions just to get to the United States, and then went through a lot to earn enough of a living to bring up Grandma and her sister Helen, and then on and on. And I was fortunate to know Nana for the first 17 years of my life. And so if it's okay with everybody, I'd like to dedicate this talk this morning to Nana, as well as to my grandmother, Sylvia, and our family, many of whom are with us today. So I can't see everybody, but I would love it if people either raise their physical hand or their Zoom hand if you like conflict. Raise your hand if you like conflict. I'm raising mine as a voter. Let's see. How many hands do I have here? Any hands? Oh, I see some hands. Okay. Well, why might that be? Why do you love conflict? Throw it in the chat, or very quickly, maybe share a thought. Esteban, you're raising your Zoom hand.
Hey, good morning, Larry. Thanks for having me. Welcome, or good morning, everybody. I like conflict because if I actually dealt with some last night and some this morning with two different groups, and it allows for not just vibrant conversation, but it allows for us to be able to expand our knowledge in whatever the topic is, or whatever the meeting topic is, to be able to gain ideas, gather information from those that are involved, and a lot of times get information from those who have either maybe some historical knowledge or some type of understanding that maybe we don't have, and so it allows for that. So
I really appreciate that. You all are going to think that Esteban is a plant, that I planted him to do that brilliant answer, but that was spontaneous. There's some other answers in the chat. It releases stress. One grows from learning, communication and learn. Conflict is a natural process moving forward towards a goal, and new options emerge. Conflict equals traction. Without traction, there's no movement, no progress. All of these are true. In my estimation, we are probably some of our truest selves when we're in conflict. We reveal what really matters to us, and that's really helpful to the people around us and to our communities and to our broader country. Obviously, the challenge is, how do we mitigate the harmful effects of conflict? How do we resolve conflict? But I don't think that we should run from conflict. I think it is as much a reality and as much of a potential asset as it can be a hindrance or a challenge. The working definition that I use, that I've drawn from my studies and a number of sources, is up on the screen, that it occurs when people interact and perceive some sort of incompatibility. Now, the reason that I say perceive is sometimes that's all it is, right? I mean, imagine if you could, a life experience where you and someone that you either are related to, friendly with, work with, involved with, are at odds about something, even for days, weeks, months, or years, only to find out that you're actually more or less on the same page. This happens all the time. And part of our challenge when we're in conflict is to make sure that we really understand each other's interests. And I'll talk a lot more about that here in a little bit. But I think that one thing that conflict allows us to do is really explore some of the most important values we hold, some of the most important resources we have, some of our most important needs, and to articulate that to our fellow party so as to grow, so as to improve our quality of life, so as to improve, hopefully, the public good as well. One of the things that I think makes conflict difficult sometimes is that a lot of us have very different styles and approaches when it comes to conflict, and these are not static. Some of us may take one style in one moment and one style in another moment. But as you look at this graph, you see that there are 5 styles enumerated here that vary based on how assertive you are and how cooperative you are. So if you look on the bottom left-hand corner, those who tend to be conflict avoidant, and I know several people like that, are generally not likely to assert their own needs, nor are they likely to want to cooperate with the other side, all the way up to collaborating, where folks are both assertive of their own needs and wanting to collaborate or cooperate with the other side. A lot of times I think people confuse compromise with collaboration or compromise with consensus. And the challenge I would make to you is that oftentimes compromise is in some way an admission of defeat, an admission that you're not really going to get what you're after, and so you're going to settle for something less than that. Think of being in a compromised position in that context. So compromise is certainly a valid option. It's always on the table, but I think that if we can find healthy ways to both assert our own needs and wants and look for ways that we can cooperate and help the other side meet their needs and wants, we're liable, I think, to get an even better outcome. A lot of times we fall into something called the conflict spiral, and I think it's fairly intuitive what it might mean, but one person feels wronged by the other, so they will punish the former party in some way with insults or with ostracism or with some sort of penalty to their business or negative gossip or something like that, and there becomes this pressure to retaliate, which of course eventually develops into a lack of trust. And it's very hard to get out of this conflict spiral, and sometimes we don't even know that we're in it until it's a little too late. But this is very common. And so the challenge I would make to you in that context is think about the times that you are most likely to be provoked in a conflictual situation, and think of ways that you could try to counteract the centrifugal force, if you will, of that conflict spiral, because it is a powerful force. We are, after all, driven by ego in a lot of cases. Even the most humble among us have egos, have self-esteem. And so anything that feels like a threat to those things can be very hard for us to ignore, and we sometimes get sucked into this metaphorical vortex. So it's something I think we have to be very cognizant of. We also have to be on the lookout for what some scholars refer to as toxic tactics, and these are things that, as the name implies, often really poison a relationship that's in conflict. So one party will blame the other party for the problems that they're having. They'll globalize. They'll say, you always do such and such, or you never do this and such. They will ignore the concerns of the other person, either by not speaking to them or by just not acknowledging what it is that you're hearing. They'll call each other names, which I know may seem like a playground thing, but obviously recent history shows us that that affects folks at all ages. It's not just something we hear on the playground. They'll interrupt. They won't give the person the respect they deserve just to be able to finish their thought. They will prejudge a person's response rather than just listening without judgment. They will decide that the person is, not worthy of respect, not worthy of acknowledgement. They'll use sarcasm. Gee, thanks so much for telling me about that. Or boy, I'm so glad you got involved in this situation. They'll state opinion as fact, and this is something that I think has become rampant in national political discourse these days, where a lot of news organizations are programming shows where the hosts are delivering their own opinions, but you're not sure where fact starts and where opinion takes over. And so when people in conflict do that, it then becomes very difficult to have a reasonable conversation, because someone is so sure that their opinion is fact that they're unwilling to be convinced that there could be another perspective. There also can be some threatening tactics that are used, which of course is very scary, especially when it can be physical or in some way violent. All of that is very much a part of our society today. And then there's something a little bit more cerebral known as cognitive dissonance. And I suspect that anyone who has studied psychology or any of the social sciences is probably familiar with this. It's this idea that even presented with what seem like a set of obvious facts or clear data, we are more inclined to go with things like our preconceived notions. For example, I see a white male, he must be of privilege, or I see an older person, I may have to speak more loudly, or whatever. I mean, I'm using just stereotypes, of course, not my own opinions, but these are things that can really influence the direction that a conflict takes, because you're not really giving the other side a chance. You could have selective perception or recall, meaning that you're only seeing the things that you object to, or you're only remembering the parts of your relationship or your interactions that have been negative. We also sometimes use group identification. Going back to what I was saying earlier, it's not Janice Litvin, it's a Bay Area white female, or it's a Walnut Creeker, an East Bay person, and identifying her as part of that group. Or she's a schooler, she's a Litvin, identifying her as that group instead of really treating her as her own person. So all of these things are in some ways reflexive. They're not things that we necessarily even are conscious of in the moment, but in the news these days, we're hearing a lot about implicit bias. And part of it, I think, is connected to these concepts of developing assumptions very early on in an engagement with somebody else, and that can really derail hopes for a trusting, mutually beneficial relationship. And then there's something that's known in the field as the conflict triangle, and this is probably fairly intuitive as you look at it, but what it means is that you can, in the same way that the spiral can start spinning around, you can see how a person's attitude towards someone can influence their behavior, which can then influence the kind of situation that they're in with the other party, or the way in which they choose to relate to that person. And it can go all different ways. So, for example, if two people are engaging very close to one another in very close physical space, like at a stadium or in a traffic incident or something, they may immediately take the attitude, oh, this person is going to try to hurt me, I have to defend myself, or I have to attack first, and that will lead them to a particular behavior. And so all of these things are very interrelated, and I think we have to be very cognizant, not just of what we do and say, but the kinds of situations we're in when we're trying to manage these conflicts, and the attitudes that we're bringing to the original conflict interaction. So I think, successfully scared the daylights out of you this morning. Hope you're off to a good start so far. But I do want to give you a couple of thoughts about how I've seen conflict transform. One of them is the notion of a new attitude. It can be very difficult in this day and age to be interacting with someone with whom you seriously disagree on some fundamental things, whether it be values, political positions, ways you've raised your children, thoughts on marriage, what have you. It can be very difficult to look at that person and have an attitude of, I love this person, or I can learn a lot from this person, or knowing this person will help me in my life. But I think that that's critical, because in the absence of that, as I've tried to demonstrate, that attitude of I'm suspicious of this person, I don't trust them, will invariably bring conflict to the surface over and over again. So part of our challenge is to see how we can evolve the attitude we take towards others with whom we might be in conflict. We need to change our behavior. So rather than saying, I need to win, and that's the only thing that matters, we need to see how we might be able to get a win for the other side while we're still getting a win. And I know that it may seem trite to talk about win-win solutions, but A, they exist. And B, the absence of win-win solutions often means that the conflict won't really get resolved. So when you go to court and you get a verdict in favor of one side or the other, you most often see an appeal if it's appealable, and the matter can stretch on for years without final resolution. And I'm not here to trash the courts. My father's a litigator. I only want to emphasize that in our interpersonal dealings and in our organizational dealings, we have to see if we can find that opportunity for there to be not just a win for my side or myself, but a way for the other side to feel whole and complete as well. And to sort of take a new approach to conflict, look at what are perceived to be the incompatibilities and invent new options. So don't tie yourself to what you think has to be the answer, like a cash settlement in a business dispute, or an admission of wrongdoing in a criminal matter or something. There could be all kinds of different ways that the parties could feel resolved, some of which may seem obvious and some of which won't. But giving yourself the space to explore that in a way that is divergent. We talk about divergent and convergent thinking. Allow yourself to be in a space with your other party where no idea is a bad idea, where all ideas are put on the table without judgment. Eventually, some criteria are established to use to evaluate those ideas, and then we filter out the ideas that aren't as feasible or practical. But I think it's really critical that we not assume that there are only a very small number of ways out. There could be some fascinatingly creative ways to make our way out of conflict. So I think that it comes down to a couple of other key tactical measures that we can take, including various communications essentials that I'll talk about in a minute, reflective listening, and integrative solutions. In communications, this may all seem very self-explanatory and very obvious, but one thing that I have observed when I interact with parties in conflict is that they often are less cognizant of these kinds of techniques because they are flooded, because they are so emotionally keyed up, whether it's fight or flight or freeze. They have surrendered control over their attitudes and behaviors to the situation. And so these are things that the scholar Robert Bolton has talked about that, again, might seem straightforward, but when it comes to something like genuineness, you may feel authentically angry, infuriated even, at someone with whom you're in conflict. I know that I've had that experience. And so figuring out a way to be genuine and at the same time empathic is a challenge. But you might say, I'm feeling really angry about how things are going here, about this situation, but I'm also aware that you're hurting too. I'm also concerned that you feel okay when we're done with this. So I'm really upset with the situation that we're in, but I also believe very strongly that you deserve closure on this also. So that's not something we may be able to summon in the heat of a moment, but I think the more we can practice it and in lower stakes situations, the more likely we can implement it when the chips are down, so to speak. And then there's the whole notion of reflective listening, and I'm sure that this is something that's not new to you, but it's this idea that we are mirroring, noticing, and clarifying. So what I heard you say was, or it sounds like you're saying, or just noticing, if someone is kind of sitting back like this with their arms folded, that's often an indication that they are really dissatisfied or uncomfortable. Or if someone says something that you think means one thing but could mean another, it doesn't hurt to ask what you think is that quote unquote stupid question, of which we know there are none, and just say, are you saying this? Because I was thinking maybe you meant that. And did I hear this right? Because believe it or not, even when we are listening carefully to someone, we often are thinking of the next thing that we're going to say. And so it's helpful just to be able to reflect back to the other party exactly what it is that they said. There's always the notion of pausing, of not immediately responding, and I think that's also very important. to be able to breathe and sort through what you're feeling and manage those feelings before you immediately respond, and then have clear-eyed thoughts and clarifications as you go. Just one last piece here before I pause for a couple of questions, is this notion of integrative solutions. So let's say that you have two parties who feel like they both want an orange. This is the classic that I'm sure many of you have heard before. They both want the orange. And so, maybe one solution might be to just cut the thing in half and each of them gets half the orange. Well, it turns out that actually what one party wants the orange for is to make juice, and what the other party wants it for is to compost the skin to use for fertilizer. And so by understanding the underlying interests, so the position might be, we both want this orange, and there's only one of them. I want the orange for myself. No, I want the orange for myself. But the underlying interests, as I said, could be, very distinct and in some ways overlapping, and in some ways distinct. And we can create a new solution if we understand what those things are. So no matter what a party initially presents as what they're wanting or concerned about, there's almost always some sort of underlying interest, some sort of underlying value. It could be respect, it could be feeling heard, it could be feeling acknowledged, or feeling like they have something to offer. There's almost always something that may just seem, I can't believe they don't have that, but they just really want to hear it from the other party to the conflict. And so the more that we can understand what those underlying interests are and spend the time to unpack what they might be with our fellow party, and maybe with the help of a third party, the better off we're likely to be. As you can see, this is a passion, not just a profession for me. And I'm honored to work for a firm, Kearns West, that is full of about 60 or more professionals around the country, including most of, actually our biggest office is in San Francisco, to be part of a team that works very hard with public and private organizations, from the very smallest nonprofit to the largest metropolis. I've worked for New York City, and I've worked for tiny local nonprofits, but all in service of helping stakeholders with differing perspectives find consensus, find solutions with which they can live and thrive. And so I'm very honored to have been given a chance to share something about which I'm so passionate, and to do it in the company of my dear Aunt Janice. I'm told that there's a lot of nepotism in this group, and that's okay. So I'd like to wish my Aunt Janice an early happy significant birthday on Saturday. And thanks to the rest of my family for being here. And I'm happy to take some questions if there are any. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Larry. Hey, Larry, do you do mediation? Is that part of what you do?
Yeah, Craig, and by the way, I love President Craig, so I'm just going to start using that all the time. Like President Craig, Vice President Janice, I'm just going to do that. Yeah, so I trained as a mediator back in 2009 at the University of Texas Law School. And, mediation is, I think, a little bit of a tricky thing sometimes for people to understand, because you start out with just that 40-hour, professional development course, and theoretically can then say, I'm a mediator. Well, the reality is you can say you're a mediator sometimes regardless. I mean, mediation is not a heavily regulated profession in a lot of places. And in fact, a lot of professionals like psychologists, clergy, attorneys even, may play mediative roles without going through the training. But I was so enamored of it that I went and got a doctorate in conflict resolution. And for those who are a little less aware, mediators are not deciding an outcome for parties in conflict. They're instead trying to help the parties reach their own resolution that they both, or more than both if there's many, that they all can live with. And so it's as much a communication art as it is any understanding of case law. It really has almost nothing to do with that. It's a lot more to do with hearing what is of concern to the parties and helping them develop solutions that will satisfy those needs, wants, and values. So yeah, I think a lot of our work is squarely in the mediation space, particularly on things like, things of the public interest, zoning, land use, planning, policing. I've done a lot of work with policing these days for obvious reasons. Civil rights, affordable housing, the environment, all things that I think people feel very passionately about and aren't aware that mediation can help them to resolve.
All right. Alan Garber has a question, and so
Sure.
does Tim Durkin.
Sure.
Thank you, Larry, for your presentation. I didn't get to hear all of it because I had to do dog duty, and the dog was starting to bark and whatever. I don't have a question. I have two comments, though. One was, I heard you were talking about win-win situations. I'm a labor and employment attorney, and so I've done a lot of litigation, and I've done a lot of mediations, and I've done a lot of collective bargaining. And I found one thing in collective bargaining, anyway, when I'm dealing with unions and we're trying to work out a collective bargaining agreement, what I found is actually the best negotiations end up with a lose-lose, not a win-win, because neither party ends up getting really what they want fully, but they get part of what they want. And so they negotiate a compromise, if you will. So it's not a really win-win. It's a compromise, not or lose-lose. My other comment is in mediations, which I've done quite a few. They come in, I think, two arenas with what I do. And I'm dealing with plaintiffs, and they're usually either wage and hour type things, or they're wrongful termination type things. Now, when they're wage and hour, it's just about money, and that's basically all it is, money. When you're dealing with other things like sexual harassment or discrimination cases, I have found a lot of times when you get into mediation, what the plaintiffs really want from the employer is an acknowledgement that there was a problem. There's an acknowledgement that maybe something went wrong, an apology maybe, and that is more important many times to the plaintiff than the monetary settlement.
Agreed.
I'd like you to comment on that.
Yeah, no, agree completely. Thanks for those perspectives, Alan. I have always said in every class I've ever taught that the thing that people in conflict are most desperate for is to feel heard. And that may be literally to feel heard or to
and
just feel and respected. Yeah.
Yes.
And that starts with the feeling of being heard. And the way we demonstrate that they've been heard is we literally share with them what we hear. And I know that may seem sometimes condescending, but it really matters, because so much of our population, so much of humanity feels disempowered. And so for someone who may seem to have a lot of power to just simply say, I'm hearing you talk about how much of a concern this is for you, or I understand that this is a big deal and we need to deal with it, straight away. And then to take action, of course. I mean, that's critical too, to show someone that they've been heard. But I think that if we don't address the initial acknowledgement, then we're not really going to have a very sturdy foundation for something that's going to last. So really appreciate that. I can take Tim's question, and then unfortunately I'm going to have to drop. But thanks, Alan.
Fantastic presentation, Larry. Thank you very much. Very, very timely. I was wondering if you know of a preface or something that can be used as a template when two people or more are going to engage in a conversation on a combustible topic, like racism, like liberal versus conservative, like any topic, it seems like today. Is there a way that you can set a ground rule that people can adhere to so that they can be heard, so that they can be respected?
That's a wonderful question, Tim. And I actually use a set of 6 discussion agreements that I have wholly plagiarized from a group called Conversation Cafe. So I encourage you to look them up. But essentially, it talks about being able to listen without judgment, to be able to speak for myself about what holds personal meaning, as opposed to saying, "Hey Tim, you're off your rocker." It's, this is what I believe, and I'm not going to tell you what to believe or that you're wrong. I'm just going to tell you what I think, and to do so with respect for the other person. So letting them finish and not taking up all of the space in the conversation. So I would encourage you to Google something like discussion agreements, Conversation Cafe, or something along those lines, and you should be able to find it. You can also email me afterwards, and I'm happy to follow up.
That's exactly what I was looking for, because I've seen conversations end before they even begin.
That's true. That's very true. Yeah. I see that someone is saying the family should be cavelling. That's very nice. Yeah. So thank you all. Thank you all so much. I'm really happy to have been able to do this. Huge thanks to Aunt Janice. Shout out to Lizzie the Gifted. I know he's back there somewhere. And thanks to my sister and my parents and my in-laws. But I do have to go. Thank you all again so much.
Thanks,
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Larry.
You will. All right. Take care.